know someone, or are you personally battling a drug and alcohol addiction? Why are so many people addicted today? And why have so many people died as a direct result of this disease? If you've been affected by this problem and want answers like we do, then join us in our efforts to face this disease. Our purpose is to examine the truths, expose the lies, and uncover and provide resources to this affliction. Come, join us in this journey.
Welcome to Addiction and Recovery TV. I'm your host, Charlene DeChico, and today we are taking an international perspective in regards to addiction and recovery. Joining me today, I have two guests from different parts of the world. I have Mick Frost, who is a former drug services worker, as well as a social activist, and he's coming to us from the Republic of Ireland. I also have Amir Shafian, who is an Iranian award-winning filmmaker. So we have an interesting show for you today, and we are going to take this international perspective. So join us, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Addiction and Recovery TV. I have my guest with me, Mr. Mick Frost, who is from the Republic of Ireland. And Mick is going to tell us a little bit about being a former drug services worker, a little bit about the status. So Mick, can you tell us a little bit about the current status of addiction and recovery in Ireland?
Hi Charlene, well thanks very much for inviting me onto your show as a guest, and I think, you know, drug use and drug addiction and recovery and the search for a solution to this problem has become a global phenomenon. I think there's more drugs available in more parts of the world. They're cheaper and they're stronger than they ever have been, and in many ways I guess they're kind of a plague on every society, if you know, from one side of the world to the other. And in Ireland, we've had a drug epidemic, and it's taken on different forms over the years.
Sure. Now, you say that word epidemic. That's a word that we use pretty heavily these days in the U.S. And is there a specific drug, Mick, that you would say is more prominent than others, or?
Well, there's been, in Ireland, it's kind of travelled in waves in the last kind of 25 years. I think there was a lot of heroin use at the end of the 70s, early 80s with the punk era, and it was a kind of a rebellious kind of time, and people thought that taking heroin was a cool thing to do. So there was a kind of an epidemic, and then there was fears around the HIV virus and AIDS and that, and people kind of turned away from it. And then towards the end of the 80s, early 90s, ecstasy was introduced, and I mean, it took the country by storm. It was Ireland was going through a very transformative period at the time. The younger generation were turning away from the church, and they were turning away from old values, and it was becoming a more liberal, conservative type of society. Money was coming in. We had become members of the European Union, and our economy was really starting to take off. In the mid-90s, the IRA declared a ceasefire, and so peace came to the island. And, you know, ecstasy was all about raves and love and people coming together, and
a little rebellion, maybe? A
little rebellion, yeah. It was like a youth. It was a big youth movement, and initially there was a lot of euphoria and happiness and things like that surrounding it. But you know, the other drugs, the harder drugs, sneaked in on the back of it, and people discovered that they could kind of use heroin in different ways, like smoking it on tin foil, which they call chasing the dragon, and people started to use it after ecstasy parties as a means to come down, and a kind of a second wave of heroin addiction came in then, and at one point in the middle of the 90s there was like 14,000 registered heroin addicts in Dublin who were on a methadone program, and I mean, it kind of took the state by surprise. I mean, this problem didn't exist, and all of a sudden, by the time the powers that be, the police, the government, the health authorities started to notice it, it was already at epidemic levels. And particularly in areas of higher unemployment and kind of, I suppose, areas you would call projects here in the United States, which kind of like social housing and areas which lacked a lot of services and kind of, I suppose, more working class type of area.
So from the drug services perspective and working in treatment, here you're seeing all of this happen, and now you're hopefully providing resources. What has it been like working in treatment and as a service provider to address this issue?
Well, the thing is that, you know, the demographic and the drug use has continually changed. So while I'm talking about this was when the big flood really started, and it started off with kind of ecstasy and heroin. But then the younger generation were looking at the people who are addicted to heroin and thinking, you know, I don't really like what these people are about. They're junkies, they're addicts, they're scumbags. So they kind of started to take different drugs. They started to get into cocaine and cannabis and, you know, pharmaceutical medication and all. So in Ireland at the moment, the most used drugs are cocaine and alcohol.
Interesting.
And you know, like cocaine is cheap, because cocaine in the 80s and early 90s was always kind of expensive. It was more of a kind of a rich man stockbrokers kind of drug. Now it's available everywhere. Then that transformed into crack cocaine. There's a massive epidemic of crack cocaine in Ireland at the moment, and so the services are continually trying to catch up with the ever-changing landscape of addiction. So it's pretty difficult. I mean, I think that to treat an opiate user is relatively straightforward. You give them a period in detox, you look after them and you give them support, maybe support them for a year or two. They tend to do pretty well. But what's happening with the younger generation is all these kind of counterfeit pharmaceuticals that are flooding in from Turkey and Iran and various other places around the world, the effects that they're having on the mental health.
Sure.
In combination with cocaine every weekend, a lot of alcohol and different things, it's a much more complex problem now than it ever was. And I think the mistake that's still being made in terms of service provision is that it's still being criminalised instead of being viewed as a health issue. I mean,
or even a mental health issue. I mean, this is
a health issue. Yeah, well, I mean, mental health. I mean, mental health is a very important part of your whole health. I guess if your mental health is off, it's pretty serious. You know, and the thing is that most of the drug users who are criminalised are, in fact, they're very, very low-level criminals. They're dealers who are looking to feed their own habit, or they're just people, you know, who, I think a lot of addiction and a lot of people who end up taking drugs on a regular basis is because they don't have the ability to communicate. They don't know how to communicate their needs. They don't understand their place in the world. And a lot of this stems from their familial experience and also their parental background. I mean, we live in a world now, capitalism is kind of, a capitalist democracy is kind of the system in most of the Western world. But it's like people are working twice as hard as they were to live twice as good as they did. Rents are double what they were. Sure. Petrol is expensive. So a lot of homes, kids are kind of left to their own devices. Parents are out, there's more divorce, there's more separations, there's more single parents, there's more social issues. People are distracted with Facebook and Instagram and all these kind of things. And I think worldwide society has kind of almost somewhat lost the ability to communicate on a one-to-one basis with each other. That, like, you know, people are kind of lost in this like zombie apocalypse of smartphones and that. And, you know, when there's that emptiness exists and you put drugs into the mix, you know, it can be a pretty exciting time, and before you know it, it's 15 years later and your life is ruined and you've been using for years. So
sure. Listen, this is a very deep perspective that we're getting here today talking to Mick, and we just thank you that you're giving us this insight, because the way that you're describing this is kind of like society, the issue that society needs to deal with. And you know, from an international perspective, a lot of the stuff that you're talking about really hits home for us in the U.S. So that's what I find is very interesting and relevant with this, because this is a universal epidemic. And just listening to you speak, I hope that we were able to follow about how this problem even occurring in society, the breakdown in society, community, and communication. And so we have this major issue, and how do we deal with it? And so we're talking with Mick today. He's talking to us about how it's affecting Ireland, and we're hearing the same thing. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the very same issues that we're having here in the U.S. And what do we do? Like, how do we address and get on top of this? And I think in the U.S., we're really compelling our government. We have our president who's speaking, trying to address this issue. It's how do we get a hold of this, and what is it? And you talked about some treatment methods. I really like that you talked about not treating the addict like a criminal, and I've heard that in Ireland they do kind of a spiritual approach. I don't know if you want to talk to us a little bit about how taking that individual and healing, the healing process through recovery.
Well, I think, it has to, in order for long-term recovery to work, in my experience, it has to be a holistic kind of approach. It's not just about the chemical substance. You take away the chemical substance, oftentimes there's so many issues there and there's so many unresolved things, particularly if someone has been a long-term drug addict.
And that's what we're talking about.
You know, and I mean, this might sound a little bit hippie-ish, but I do think that the real problem is actually a lack of love in the world, a lack of loving communication. That, like I said earlier on, we don't communicate in a way that's kind of healthy. And, we're all focused on our career and we're focused on the things we've got and we're working so hard. And, a lot of times, even for people who aren't caught up in addiction, their social activities revolve around the pub and they revolve around drinking, or they revolve at being at sports things and that. And I think there's more loneliness in the world than there ever was, even though from a technology perspective, there's more global communication than ever. I think on an individual level, people are kind of more isolated maybe than they ever were, Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been an interesting conversation. And at Addiction and Recovery TV, that's what we're actually trying to reach the nation and the world, using communication and kind of compassion, having more of a compassion, raising awareness. So I think that we've had a really good discussion today about the problem, even the solution, and really kind of pinpointing where it's all coming from. So we just want to thank Mick for his time today. And if there's anything you want to let the public know in closing, just any last remarks, I think that we've painted a really good picture.
Well, I think, what's kind of missing is like you just talked about it there, about compassion and education. And I think that perhaps if we kind of did more of that at an earlier age with children, maybe 5 to 9 year olds in schools, and we taught them about kind of more about bullying, about communication, how to express their needs, about meditation, about mindfulness, and make them understand that throughout their lives they are going to have times when they're not okay, and it's okay not to be okay. And if they have the wisdom and the understanding of how to reach out when they're in those places, perhaps there's a better chance that they might reach out to another person instead of reaching out for a pill or a powder or a drink or something like that.
That's good. That's awesome. Thank you so much, Mick. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Addiction and Recovery TV. I'm your host, Charlene DeChico, and we're continuing our discussion about an international perspective when it comes to addiction and recovery. And so we're joined with our award-winning filmmaker from Iran, who is Amir Shafien. And Amir's going to tell us a little bit about what inspired you to even make film about addiction, or just give us a little insight.
Thank you for having me on your program. Well, it's always hard to produce an outstanding piece of work when it comes to motion pictures or any sort of arts. And the main challenge was just going to Iran and shoot a documentary.
So these are some of the challenges. We're talking to Amir about a documentary as a filmmaker that he created in regards to addiction. I want to ask you, Amir, but what inspired you? Because you yourself are not an addict, so what inspired you to make a film about drug addicts?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, actually. I don't even smoke. But the thing is, it's part of the culture, because if you study different cultures, they have their own reason and purposes to get into heavy drug. Okay. If you look back in 60s, 70s, rock and roll, heavy drugs, heroin, cocaine, etc., and then rock stars, just girls, and some of them we watched some documentaries and some movies about them. They got into big trouble. They got HIV positive as a result of using drugs. It's the same in part of the world, but in Iran it's the whole different story, because you are dealing with two different subject matters. Bear in mind, it's an Islamic country, and drinking alcohol, it's haram. Not only illegal, it's haram.
So what does that mean?
Meaning, because the law are different. They practice their own version of Islam, and we call it Sharia law. So you cannot change it. You cannot get away with it. You cannot get around yeah, like the law, you know, because some people say, I mean, that's not my belief. I obey the rules and law, but some people say laws are written or are made to be broken. You cannot get away with Sharia law because it's based on a religion. It's there. If you drink alcohol for any matter, there is a punishment. So they whip you basically. But smoking, hookah, is part of their culture. If you study Persian culture back 1,000 years ago, they basically invented hookah and smoking, tobacco and cigarette. And if you do some sort of drugs, it's like part of their culture. If you go to some cities, when you go to a household, they welcome you, they put opioid in front of you. Hey, this is like smoke, yeah, smoke is part of their culture. Or they put basically hookah, there we go, you know, this is the hose, go ahead and smoke it. But alcohol, they say it's dirty because it's not part of their religion. If you go to the mosque, if you drink alcohol, you cannot pray to Allah for 40 days, you know, so they take it seriously. So what happens, they start using drugs, and again, it is illegal, but it is not part of the Sharia law. So what happens, the government has some places for drug addicts, and they treat them. And the other reason I set up my camera there was because I watched some movies, unfortunately Iranian movies, features or documentaries, and they shot in a dungy, very rundown, dark, dirty places. Bunch of drug addicts, they went there, they call it recreation centers. And I just wanted to show the reality, because the reality is not what you see on some programs. The reality is they have some recreational centers, and most of people over there, they are just lonely, and they have their own issues. They just want to run away from their own people, and that was the main challenge for me to go there. And I had the script and outline once I went there, because they didn't let us to do a research. We needed to do research. I just wanted to show to the audience these places are beautiful. They have swimming pool, they have garden, they have some people working there voluntarily, you know, and there are some organization, they provide them food and accommodation. So basically they are there and they have to do nothing. The issue is, when I talk to some experts, they may be there for 3 to 6 months and they don't take drugs anymore.
Right.
They get into a good shape because they work out, and you know, if you don't take drugs and work out and eat healthy, sleep healthy, you get into a good shape. As soon as they leave those properties or those recreational centers, they go back to their own community, hit by reality. Within 3 to 6 months, they start taking drugs.
Sure.
And they go back to the same spot or maybe different spot after a year. So they have a big list. Oh, we know this guy, you know, he's the local, you know, he's
Sure.
a regular.
So we were talking to Amir, and he's giving us an perspective, and we're actually talking an international perspective when it comes to addiction. And what we're hearing is that same vicious cycle that we see in the U.S. is very prominent even in Iran. We're looking at different parts of the world, and that seems to be the ongoing issue. An addict that may receive treatment continues to go back. And so we're not getting to the place where addicts can stay clean. And Amir talked about his documentary where they attend a fellowship program that helps them get clean or get healthy. So we're hearing about the challenges that you face making your documentary and even dealing with addiction in the culture, in Iranian culture. Is there something you could tell us that you learned, not only from your experiences or even making your documentary or other filmmaking process, just in about addiction overall, that you want to share with us, a learning experience?
Yeah, the addiction itself is dangerous. I mean, the definition of addiction, you can addict to anything, you know. Some people are not addicted to drugs or just alcohol. Some of them are workaholic, you know, they have to work, they're addicted to work. If they don't work, they go crazy, they go mental. Or some other people are addicted to date different types of people. They cannot spend quality time with one person, whatever their sexual orientation is. It's hard for those kind of people to stick to the plan. It's more about state of mind. It's not about taking a drug. And basically, when it comes to the difference between reality and your dreams or what you have in your mind, people cannot get a balance, or they are not strong enough to push the limit to the next level. So the easiest way, say, oh, okay, this is the easy way. You know, they take the drug, it comes here, you know, brain, and they project false image.
Sure. And in recent news, we saw an article and we also saw a segment that they were doing a story, trying to cover a story in Iran about the drug use and substance abuse. And not only was it they weren't able to get in and really do the story with permission, but we see a real outbreak of substance abuse. And so being that this is a country where you were born and you yourself have made film and documentary under the same umbrella, the topic of addiction, and in particular, whatever drugs you want to talk about. What do you see for the future, and what do you think this is going to mean for the culture and just the addiction problem, the epidemic? We talk about it being an epidemic.
Well, you know, drug substance abuse is a global issue. Funny thing, alcohol is very expensive over there. Like I said, it's against
illegal.
Yeah, it's against Sharia law. But taking drugs is cheaper because basically you can go to any pharmacy and purchase painkillers.
Over the counter?
Over the counter, yeah. You can buy painkillers, strong painkillers over the counter. Whereas here in the U.S., you have to go to the doctor and they prescribe you. So what happens over there, they can easily have access to painkillers and heavy drugs. And because of the border to Afghanistan, it's very easy to transport drugs, and it goes there, and people take it very often.
Well, we've had an interesting discussion, and we're going to continue to talk about this problem from an international perspective. And we just want to thank you, Amir, for talking with us today. And you can check out his documentary, Garden. You can find that online. And so stay tuned. We're going to continue our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Addiction and Recovery TV. I'm your host, Charlene DeChico, and we've had an interesting show today looking at addiction from an international perspective. And so I thank my guests for joining us, and I want to leave them with a question that they could answer to maybe kind of spark this initiative of what can we do to change and make a difference in this world of addiction. And so, Amir, If you were placed tomorrow in charge of drug policy, what would you do or how would you handle the situation?
Well, it's a big responsibility. I'm not sure about it, but the thing is, what strikes me is if we all get together as one person, because substance abuse is a global issue, and across the globe everybody has a lot of problems and issues, regardless of our race, country of birth, religion, and color skin, educated, uneducated, whatever, they are rich or poor, they get together and we spread out our friendship instead of drugs or substances. We get together and we have a quality time.
Awesome. Unity. Sounds like unity. That's a great response. So, Mick, I'm going to ask you the same question. You're in charge starting tomorrow, drug policy. How would you handle the situation?
Well, I mean, I always, based on the experience that I've had and what I've seen throughout the years, I feel that what is the most compassionate solution when someone is suffering? What is the most compassionate way to manage that suffering? And I think the approach that we're using currently it's not working. There's no arguing against it. You can say whatever you like. Drug policy around the world is not working. And I think one of the biggest problems with drugs is the crime. The gangland, the cartels, all the criminality, the domestic violence, all these kind of things that go with drug abuse. So the first thing I would do is, and this is going to be controversial, and a lot of people, they don't want to look at anything controversial. They don't want to engage in serious change. They don't want to upset the apple cart because it terrifies them. But I do think that what I would do in the morning, if I was put in charge of drug policy,
in the morning,
straight away, bang, is allow addicts to register as addicts and provide them with narcotics by the state and offer them the opportunity to access help while they're engaging in their active addiction. You know, and this might sound like an extreme solution, but history has taught us that sometimes it's only the extreme solutions that actually lead to any kind of lasting change. Like I said earlier on in the interview, drugs have won the war on drugs. We need to figure out a way to manage our surrender so that we can help people, because at the end of the day, every addict is someone's daughter, someone's son, someone's mother, someone's father. You know, they're human beings at the end of the day. They're not criminals and they're not animals. They've fallen into a difficult way of life, and, you know, we've got to figure out how to help them.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And this has been another broadcast of Addiction and Recovery TV. Thank you. Thank you. Hopefully, as you tune into this broadcast, you will want to know more information. You'll want to find out the truth for yourself. And you'll realize that people are just hurting and in need of healing. There are resources, there is therapy, there is many ways and means to learn a new way of life. But are we helping people in finding these ways? Are we judging people? Are we dismissing people, counting people out? So not only are we dealing with the addict on this broadcast, but we're dealing with people that have to deal with the addict. And how are you helping this person, if you are? Or do you consider yourself above these people? These are all questions that we should ask ourselves and even continue to ask our guests. So continue with us at Addiction and Recovery TV. We want to hear from you and we would like your feedback. Follow us on Facebook and contact us today. We can make a difference.